Hey guys, tonight we're climbing Mount Olympus, but don't expect halos and perfect role models waiting at the summit. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I always enjoy seeing how far these late night journeys travel around the world. Before we begin cataloguing the countless romantic disasters, questionable decisions, and spectacularly unhealthy relationships of the Greek gods, it helps to leave behind one very modern assumption, that the Olympians were supposed to be moral examples. They weren't. Not even slightly. Unlike many later religious traditions, the gods of ancient Greece were not portrayed as perfectly good or perfectly just. They were immortal, unimaginably powerful, and often breathtakingly selfish. They could create life, control storms, command the oceans, or send plagues, but emotional maturity was apparently not included among their divine gifts. To the ancient Greeks, the gods represented the forces of the universe itself. The sea could nourish fishermen one day and drown them the next. Love could bring joy or spark a war. The harvest could flourish or fail without warning. Their gods reflected that same unpredictability. They were beautiful, terrifying, generous, cruel, loyal, deceitful, compassionate, and vindictive, often within the same story. That makes reading Greek mythology a bit like attending the world's most dysfunctional family reunion. Everyone is related. Everyone has a grudge. Almost everyone has dated or attempted to date someone they probably shouldn't have. Modern readers are often surprised by the sheer number of stories involving deception, coercion, revenge, jealousy, and relationships that would today raise every imaginable ethical concern. But these tales were never written as instruction manuals for proper behaviour. Instead, they served as explanations for the world, cautionary tales about power, or simply dramatic stories designed to captivate audiences around a fire, in a theatre, or during religious festivals. It's also important to remember that these myths evolved over centuries. There was no single official version. Poets such as Homer, Hesiod, Pindar, and later playwrights constantly reshaped familiar stories, sometimes portraying a god as noble, other times as deeply unsettling. A character who behaves one way in one myth may act completely differently in another. Consistency was never the priority. Good storytelling was. Even the word perversion would have meant something very different to an ancient Greek audience. Many relationships that appear shocking today reflected social structures, symbolic meanings, or literary traditions of their own time, while others were deliberately written to emphasize the dangers of absolute power. The gods could ignore rules because, quite simply, they made the rules. That does not mean ancient audiences necessarily approved of everything the gods did. In fact, many myths quietly criticize divine behavior through the suffering of mortals. Heroes, queens, nymphs, shepherds, and kings often become collateral damage in the Olympians' endless rivalries and desires. So, as we wander through Olympus, it's worth remembering one thing. These are not stories about perfect beings living perfect lives. They are stories about immortal powers with very human flaws, only magnified to a cosmic scale, where every obsession could reshape kingdoms, create monsters, or change the course of history. If Mount Olympus had an official human resources department, Zeus would almost certainly have been summoned for an endless series of meetings. Unfortunately for everyone involved, he was both the chief executive and the supreme authority, making disciplinary action somewhat difficult. As king of the gods, Zeus ruled the sky, thunder, justice, and divine order. Yet for someone responsible for maintaining cosmic balance, he displayed remarkably little restraint when it came to romance, or more accurately, pursuit. Greek mythology contains so many stories of Zeus seeking lovers that ancient writers themselves occasionally joked about it. One of his defining characteristics was his willingness to change shape. Being the ruler of the universe apparently wasn't always persuasive enough. When he desired Europa, a Phoenician princess, Zeus transformed himself into a magnificent white bull. Gentle and unusually beautiful, the animal encouraged Europa to climb onto its back. The moment she did, the bull raced into the sea, carrying her all the way to Crete. There she became the mother of King Minos, whose descendants would later include the famous Minotaur. For Danae, Zeus chose an even stranger approach. Locked inside a bronze chamber by her father, who hoped to prevent a prophecy from coming true, Danae seemed unreachable. Zeus responded by becoming a shower of golden light that entered her prison through the roof. From that union came Perseus, destined to slay Medusa despite every attempt to stop his birth. Perhaps the most famous deception involved Alcmene, the future mother of Heracles. Zeus disguised himself as her husband, Amphitryon, returning home before the real warrior arrived. Ancient authors disagreed over the exact details, but the story illustrates a recurring pattern. Zeus frequently relied on disguise, illusion, or transformation rather than honest courtship. Other myths are far darker. Io, a priestess devoted to Hera, attracted Zeus's attention and soon found herself transformed into a white cow. Whether Zeus or Hera caused the transformation varies by source, but her suffering remained constant. Hera assigned the 100-eyed giant Argus to guard her, forcing Zeus to send Hermes to rescue her before Io wandered across much of the known world. Callisto's story ends even more tragically. A follower of Artemis sworn to chastity, she became pregnant after Zeus approached her, again, through deception in many versions. Hera's fury fell not upon Zeus, but upon Callisto, who was transformed into a bear before eventually becoming the constellation Ursa Major. These myths can be deeply uncomfortable to modern readers, and many scholars argue they were meant to illustrate what happens when absolute power exists without accountability. Zeus rarely faced consequences himself. Instead, it was mortals who endured exile, transformation, suffering, or death. Ironically, the king who enforced divine law often proved the least capable of following any limits when desire entered the picture. For the Greeks, this contradiction did not weaken Zeus's authority. It emphasized a central lesson of their mythology. Immense power did not guarantee perfect virtue, even among the rulers of heaven. If Zeus was the most prolific pursuer on Olympus, Hera was undoubtedly its most relentless investigator. As the queen of the gods and goddess of marriage, she spent much of Greek mythology confronting the impossible task of protecting an institution that her own husband repeatedly ignored. One might expect Hera's anger to fall primarily upon Zeus. Occasionally, it did. More often, however, the victims of Zeus's affairs, whether willing participants, deceived mortals, or entirely innocent bystanders, became the targets of her fury. It is one of the recurring tragedies of Greek mythology. The supreme god rarely suffered lasting consequences, while those with far less power paid the price. Perhaps no figure illustrates this better than Heracles. Before he was even born, Hera despised him simply because he was Zeus's son by the mortal Alcmene. She delayed his birth through divine intervention, allowing another child to be born first and inherit a kingdom that prophecy had promised to Heracles. Her hostility did not end there. While Heracles was still an infant, Hera sent 2 enormous serpents into his cradle, hoping to kill him in his sleep. Instead, the the baby calmly strangled both snakes with his bare hands, a rather unusual childhood achievement, even by heroic standards. Years later, Hera struck again by sending Heracles into a fit of madness. During this terrible episode, he unknowingly killed his own wife and children. Horrified once his sanity returned, he sought purification, eventually accepting the famous 12 labours as penance. Thus, one of Greece's greatest heroes began his legendary career because of divine vengeance. Io suffered in a different way. After Zeus attempted to conceal her by transforming her into a white cow, or, in some versions, after Hera herself forced the transformation, Hera demanded the animal as a gift. She then appointed Argus, the giant with 100 eyes, to watch over her constantly. Even after Hermes rescued Io by killing Argus, Hera sent a relentless gadfly to sting her across continents, ensuring that her suffering continued. Callisto faced an equally cruel fate. Once a devoted follower of Artemis, she became pregnant through Zeus's intervention. Hera transformed her into a bear, stripping away both her human appearance and her former life. Years later, Zeus placed Callisto among the stars as the constellation Ursa Major, though only after unimaginable hardship. Even Semele, mother of Dionysus, became entangled in Hera's schemes. Disguising herself as an elderly woman, Hera convinced the young princess to demand proof of Zeus's divinity. Bound by an oath, Zeus revealed himself in all his heavenly glory. No mortal body could survive such a sight, and Semele perished instantly in divine fire. Modern readers often wonder why Hera rarely punished Zeus himself. The answer may lie in the structure of Greek mythology. Zeus was king of the gods, and even Hera could not overthrow his authority. Instead, her revenge fell upon those who stood within reach. In many ways, Hera became another tragic figure rather than a simple villain. She represented marriage, fidelity, and legitimate family, yet lived eternally beside the greatest adulterer in mythology. Her anger, however misplaced, reflected the frustration of a goddess trapped in an unequal divine order, one where the ruler of Olympus could break every vow, while everyone else endured the consequences. If Zeus ruled the heavens with thunder, Poseidon ruled the seas with waves that could nourish entire civilizations or erase them overnight. Ancient sailors respected him, not because he was kind, but because he was unpredictable. His personality mirrored the ocean itself, calm one moment, devastating the next. That same unpredictability appears throughout his relationships. Like his brother Zeus, Poseidon frequently pursued both mortal women and divine beings. Many of these myths involve transformation, coercion, and the birth of extraordinary children, reinforcing the idea that the sea god's desires were as impossible to resist as the tides themselves. One of the most famous and disturbing stories concerns Medusa. Modern audiences often imagine Medusa as a monster from the beginning, but early traditions describe her as a beautiful mortal woman and priestess serving Athena. According to the version told by the Roman poet Ovid centuries later, Poseidon desired Medusa and lay with her inside Athena's sacred temple. Whether the encounter was consensual or forced has been debated by scholars for generations, but Athena's response remains startling. Rather than punishing Poseidon, she transformed Medusa into the snake-haired Gorgon whose gaze turned people to stone. The myth reflects a recurring pattern already familiar on Olympus. The more powerful deity escapes unharmed, while someone with far less power bears the consequences. Poseidon's pursuit of Demeter is equally unusual. Attempting to avoid him, Demeter transformed herself into a mare and hid among a herd of horses. Poseidon immediately recognized the deception, or perhaps simply admired the creativity, and transformed himself into a magnificent stallion. Their union produced Arion, a legendary horse said to possess extraordinary speed and intelligence, along with a mysterious daughter whose name was considered too sacred for ordinary worshippers to speak aloud. Transformation, it seems, solved many logistical problems in Greek mythology. Poseidon's marriage to Aphrodite offers a somewhat gentler story. Initially unwilling to marry him, Aphrodite fled into the depths of the sea. Rather than pursuing her personally forever, Poseidon sent dolphins to persuade her. One dolphin proved so successful that it was later immortalized among the stars as the constellation Delphinus. Not every relationship ended peacefully. Poseidon fathered countless children, many of whom became monsters, giants, or fearsome warriors. Among them was Polyphemus, the one-eyed Cyclops later encountered by Odysseus. Other offspring included giants, sea creatures, and powerful kings who inherited aspects of their father's immense strength and violent temperament. Even Caeneus presents a fascinating reversal. Originally born as the woman Caeneus, the hero was granted a wish by Poseidon after their encounter. Caeneus asked to become an invulnerable man so that no one could ever overpower them again. Poseidon granted the request, creating the warrior Caeneus, who became famous for extraordinary courage before eventually falling during the battle against the centaurs. These myths reveal a god driven by appetite and impulse rather than restraint. Like the sea itself, Poseidon could provide abundance, grant magnificent gifts, or unleash destruction without warning. To the ancient Greeks, this inconsistency was not a contradiction. It was simply the nature of the ocean and the immortal who ruled it. Among the Olympians, Apollo often appears as one of the most refined. He was the god of music, poetry, prophecy, healing, archery, and sunlight. Artists portrayed him as eternally youthful, impossibly handsome, and astonishingly talented. If Olympus had awarded prizes for appearances alone, Apollo would probably have built himself a trophy room. Yet beneath that polished image lay a recurring flaw shared by many of his divine relatives. He did not handle rejection well. Again and again, Apollo pursued lovers who either could not, or simply did not wish to, return his affection. Unlike Zeus, Apollo rarely disguised himself or transformed into animals. Instead, his stories often revolve around relentless pursuit, wounded pride, and tragic endings. Perhaps the most famous example is Daphne. According to the myth, Apollo mocked Eros, claiming that the young god's tiny bow could never compare to his own mighty weapon. Eros, not particularly impressed by this unsolicited career advice, decided to teach Apollo a lesson. He struck Apollo with a golden arrow that inspired overwhelming love, while Daphne, a devoted follower of Artemis, was pierced with a lead arrow that caused complete rejection of romance. The result was inevitable. Apollo chased Daphne through forests and mountains, desperately declaring his love while she fled in terror. Just as he was about to catch her, Daphne prayed to her father, the river god Peneus, for rescue. Her body stiffened, her arms became branches, and her feet rooted themselves into the earth. She transformed into the first laurel tree. Apollo embraced the tree instead, declaring the laurel forever sacred to him. Even the victors of athletic games would later wear laurel wreaths in memory of the woman who escaped him by becoming a plant. Another tragic tale involves Cassandra, Princess of Troy. Apollo fell in love with her and offered an extraordinary gift, the power of prophecy. Cassandra accepted the blessing, but rejected the god himself. Unable to reclaim the divine gift, Apollo devised a punishment of remarkable cruelty. He ensured that every prophecy Cassandra spoke would be perfectly accurate, but that no one would ever believe her. She warned her family about the Trojan horse. She predicted the city's destruction. She foresaw countless deaths. Every warning was ignored. The curse turned knowledge itself into a prison. Apollo's relationship with Coronis ended differently. While she carried his child, she fell in love with another man. When Apollo learned of her betrayal through a raven, according to some traditions, he ordered her death in a burst of anger. Yet as her funeral pyre burned, remorse overcame him. Apollo rescued the unborn infant from her body. That child became Asclepius, the legendary god of medicine, proving that even one of Apollo's darkest moments gave rise to healing. Not all of Apollo's loves involved women. His affection for the Spartan prince Hyacinthus is among the most celebrated relationships in Greek mythology. The two spent their days hunting, competing in athletics, and enjoying one another's company. Their happiness ended during a game of discus when Hyacinthus was struck in the head by a fatal throw. Some versions blame a jealous west wind, Zephyrus, who redirected the discus out of envy. As Hyacinthus died, Apollo transformed his blood into the hyacinth flower, ensuring his beloved would be remembered forever. Across these myths, Apollo embodies a painful contradiction. He inspired beauty, art, wisdom, and healing. Yet his own desires frequently ended in grief. His stories remind us that even the brightest god on Olympus cast long shadows. Among the Olympian gods, Artemis stands apart. While many of her fellow deities spent their immortal lives pursuing lovers, Artemis rejected romance altogether. As the goddess of the hunt, wilderness, childbirth, and the moon, she vowed eternal virginity, surrounding herself with nymphs who made the same sacred promise. To Artemis, chastity was not simply a personal preference. It was a sacred bond that defined her identity and protected her independence in a world where even goddesses were frequently pursued by powerful male gods. Anyone who threatened that sanctuary often discovered just how unforgiving she could be. One of the best-known examples is the story of Actaeon. A skilled hunter, Actaeon wandered through the forests one afternoon after a successful hunt. By pure accident, according to most versions, he came upon Artemis bathing in a secluded spring with her attendants. He had no intention of spying, but intentions mattered little once the goddess realized she had been seen. Furious that a mortal had witnessed her in such a vulnerable moment, Artemis scooped water from the spring and splashed it across his face. Immediately, antlers burst from his head. His hands became hooves. His voice disappeared, replaced by the cry of a stag. Unable to explain himself, Actaeon fled into the forest while his own hunting dogs caught his scent. Not recognizing their beloved master, they chased him down and tore him apart. Ancient audiences debated whether the punishment fit the crime. Some saw it as a warning about respecting divine boundaries. Others viewed it as another example of the gods acting with terrifying disproportion. Callisto's story is even more tragic. As one of Artemis's closest companions, Callisto had sworn to remain a virgin. Depending on the version of the myth, Zeus either seduced or deceived her, sometimes disguising himself as Artemis herself. When Callisto's pregnancy became visible, the truth could no longer be hidden. Artemis, believing her companion had willingly broken her sacred oath, expelled her from the hunt. In some traditions, Artemis herself shot Callisto with an arrow. In others, Hera transformed her into a bear before later placing her among the stars as Ursa Major. Regardless of the version, Callisto lost everything, despite having little control over her fate. Another lesser-known myth concerns Cypriotes, a young Cretan who accidentally witnessed Artemis bathing. Unlike Actaeon, Cypriotes begged the goddess for mercy. Artemis spared his life, but transformed him into a woman. ensuring he could never reveal what he had seen as a man. Then there is Orion, the giant hunter, whose relationship with Artemis varies dramatically between ancient sources. Some describe them as close companions who hunted together. Others suggest Apollo grew jealous, fearing his sister might abandon her vow of chastity. In one famous version, Apollo challenged Artemis to strike a tiny object floating far out at sea with one of her arrows. Trusting her unmatched skill, she fired without hesitation. Only afterward did she discover that the distant target had been Orion's head as he swam through the waves. Heartbroken, Artemis placed him among the stars as the constellation Orion, where he still appears to pursue the Pleiades across the night sky. Unlike Aphrodite, who celebrated desire, Artemis embodied freedom from it. Yet her determination to preserve that freedom often came with startling severity. Her myths remind us that in Greek mythology, even virtue could become dangerous when defended by absolute divine power. If Artemis represented restraint, Aphrodite embodied its complete opposite. Born from sea foam after the severed remains of Uranus fell into the ocean, at least according to Hesiod, Aphrodite arrived in the world already fully grown, impossibly beautiful, and destined to wield a power even Zeus approached with caution. Unlike thunderbolts or earthquakes, her weapon was invisible. She could inspire overwhelming desire in gods, mortals, kings, queens, and heroes alike. The Greeks understood that armies could be resisted. Love, unfortunately, was far less cooperative. Ironically, the goddess of love was married to Hephaestus, the divine blacksmith. Wise, talented, and endlessly hard-working, Hephaestus possessed many admirable qualities. Unfortunately for him, irresistible beauty was not generally listed among them. The marriage itself was largely political. Ancient myths suggest Zeus arranged it to prevent conflict among the gods, many of whom desired Aphrodite. It solved one problem while creating several new ones. Aphrodite soon began a passionate affair with Ares, the god of war. Their relationship became one of Olympus's worst-kept secrets. While Hephaestus spent his days forging miraculous weapons beneath volcanic mountains, Aphrodite and Ares met in secret whenever they believed the coast was clear. As we shall see in the next chapter, secrecy was not their greatest strength, yet Ares was far from Aphrodite's only lover. One of her most famous mortal relationships was with Anchises, a handsome Trojan shepherd. According to the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, Zeus himself caused the goddess to fall in love with the mortal after growing tired of her making other gods fall helplessly in love with humans. It was, in essence, divine revenge. Disguising herself as a beautiful princess, Aphrodite approached Anchises on Mount Ida. The two spent the night together, and afterward she revealed her true identity. Understandably, Anchises panicked. Sleeping with a goddess rarely came with an instruction manual. Aphrodite assured him he would live, but warned him never to boast about their encounter. Naturally, in some versions of the myth, he eventually did exactly that. Zeus struck him with a thunderbolt, or at least crippled him, depending on the tradition. Their son, however, became Aeneas, one of the greatest Trojan heroes, and, later in Roman mythology, the legendary ancestor of Rome itself. Then there is Adonis. Unlike many divine romances, this story centered on genuine affection rather than conquest. Adonis was a breathtakingly handsome young hunter whom Aphrodite loved deeply. She begged him to avoid dangerous animals, warning that courage and wild boars rarely ended well together. Adonis ignored the advice. While hunting, he was fatally gored by a boar. Every family has that one scandal everyone knows about, but pretends not to mention at dinner. On Mount Olympus, there was little point pretending. The gods enjoyed gossip almost as much as they enjoyed immortality. No affair became more famous than the secret relationship between Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and Ares, the god of war. At first glance, the pairing almost makes sense. Aphrodite represented irresistible attraction, while Ares embodied raw passion, violence, and impulsiveness. Both acted first and considered the consequences much later, if at all. The only complication was that Aphrodite was already married. Her husband, Hephaestus, was unlike the other Olympians. Lame since birth and often described as physically unattractive, he nevertheless possessed unmatched intelligence and craftsmanship. Every palace on Olympus, every miraculous weapon, every intricate piece of divine jewellery owed something to his extraordinary skill. Unfortunately, even the finest blacksmith cannot forge mutual affection. While Hephaestus worked in his volcanic workshop, Aphrodite and Ares met in secret. They believed no one knew of their meetings. They underestimated the sun. Helios, whose daily journey across the sky allowed him to observe nearly everything beneath him, witnessed the affair and informed Hephaestus. Rather than confronting the lovers in a burst of anger, the smith god responded with remarkable patience and a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of engineering. He forged an invisible net from impossibly fine bronze chains. The mesh was so delicate that it could not be seen, yet so strong that not even Olympian gods could break it. He quietly placed the trap over his marriage bed before pretending to leave on a journey. Predictably, Aphrodite invited Ares to visit. The moment the two lay together, the hidden net sprang into place, wrapping around them so tightly that neither could move. It was, perhaps, the least dignified position in which two immortal deities had ever found themselves. Instead of dealing with the matter privately, Hephaestus summoned the entire male population of Olympus to witness the scene. Zeus, Poseidon, Hermes, Apollo, and the other gods gathered around the trapped couple. Ancient poets describe what happened next with almost mischievous delight. They laughed, not politely, not discreetly. They laughed loudly enough that the episode became one of the best-known comic stories in Greek mythology. Hermes even joked that he would gladly trade places with Ares despite the embarrassment, simply for the opportunity to lie beside Aphrodite. Apollo found the entire situation highly entertaining. Poseidon eventually persuaded Hephaestus to release the lovers, promising that Ares would pay an appropriate compensation if necessary. Whether that payment was ever made remains uncertain. The affair produced several children, including Eros in some traditions, along with Harmonia, whose very name means harmony, a surprisingly peaceful daughter for the offspring of love and war. The story reveals another side of Greek mythology often forgotten today. Not every tale involving desire ended in violence or tragedy. Some served as comedies, exposing the vanity, foolishness, and very human weaknesses of the gods. Even the rulers of Olympus could be caught by jealousy, embarrassed before their peers, and outsmarted by a clever craftsman with enough bronze wire and enough patience. Sometimes the greatest weapon in mythology was not a thunderbolt or a spear, but an exceptionally well-designed trap. If Apollo represented order, harmony, and self-control, his half-brother Dionysus celebrated everything that happened once those qualities disappeared. Dionysus was the god of wine, fertility, theatre, celebration, and ecstatic ritual. But reducing him to simply the god of wine misses the point entirely. Wine was merely the doorway. Dionysus ruled altered states of mind, the moment when ordinary rules dissolved and people became someone else, if only for a single night. To the Greeks, this could be liberating. It could also be terrifying. Unlike the polished courts of Olympus, Dionysus preferred wandering the countryside surrounded by satyrs, maenads, and followers who abandoned conventional society. His processions were loud, chaotic, and unpredictable. Music echoed through forests, drums thundered across mountainsides, and dancing continued until exhaustion blurred the line between celebration and madness. The maenads, whose name literally means the raving ones, became the god's most famous companions. These women left their homes during Dionysian festivals, climbing into the hills where they entered ecstatic trances through music, dance, and wine. Ancient writers described them carrying ivy-covered staffs called thyrsoi, wearing animal skins, and believing themselves temporarily united with the god himself. Modern readers sometimes imagine these gatherings as little more than enormous parties. Greek myths paint a far stranger picture. When challenged or threatened, the maenads could become frighteningly violent. In Euripides' tragedy The Bacchae, King Pentheus refuses to recognize Dionysus as a true god. Determined to expose what he believes is immoral behavior, he secretly spies on the women celebrating in the mountains. Dionysus, never one to ignore an insult, convinces Pentheus to disguise himself as a woman before approaching the gathering. It proves to be a spectacularly poor decision. Driven into divine frenzy, the maenads mistake Pentheus for a wild animal. Among them is his own mother Agave, who tears him apart with her bare hands before returning triumphantly to the city, carrying what she believes is a lion's head. Only after the madness fades does she realize she is holding her son's severed head. It is one of the darkest scenes in all of Greek tragedy. Dionysus himself often blurred traditional boundaries. Ancient art sometimes portrayed him with soft, almost feminine features, long flowing hair and elaborate robes rather than the muscular appearance typical of other male gods. His followers included both men and women, nobles and slaves, Greeks and foreigners. Before Dionysus, social status mattered surprisingly little. This fluidity extended into many of his myths. Rather than fitting neatly into conventional categories, Dionysus embodied transformation itself. Masks, costumes, theatre, intoxication, and ritual allowed people to step outside their ordinary identities, exploring emotions normally restrained by society. His own birth reflected this theme of transformation. After Semele died upon witnessing Zeus's divine form, Zeus rescued the unborn child and sewed him into his own thigh until the pregnancy was complete. Dionysus thus became known as the twice-born, entering the world in one of mythology's most unusual deliveries. The Greeks did not see Dionysus as evil. They saw him as necessary. Civilization required laws, discipline, and reason, but it also required moments when those pressures could be released. Dionysus reminded humanity that suppressing every instinct indefinitely could become just as dangerous as surrendering to every impulse. His myths were never simply about drunkenness or excess. They explored what happens when people lose themselves, and whether they are ever truly the same once they return. Not every god pursued love with thunderbolts or grand declarations. Some preferred trickery. Others simply chased whoever happened to be nearby. Hermes, the swift-footed messenger of the gods, was famous for his intelligence, humour, and remarkable ability to escape the consequences of almost anything. On the very day he was born, he supposedly stole Apollo's cattle, invented the lyre, lied convincingly about both events, and somehow ended the day with a new friendship instead of eternal punishment. That talent for persuasion extended well beyond stolen livestock. Unlike Zeus or Poseidon, Hermes appears less frequently in myths centered on relentless pursuit, but he still fathered numerous children with both goddesses and mortal women. One of his most famous relationships was with Aphrodite. Their union produced Hermaphroditus, whose story became one of the most unusual in all of Greek mythology. As a remarkably handsome youth, Hermaphroditus attracted the attention of the water nymph Salmacis. She fell instantly in love and repeatedly begged him to stay with her. Hermaphroditus politely refused. When he entered a secluded pool to bathe, Salmacis embraced him and prayed that they would never be separated. The gods answered her request rather literally. Their bodies merged into a single form, creating one being that possessed both male and female characteristics. Ancient writers use the myth to explain the origin of the figure known as Hermaphroditus, though modern discussions naturally approach the story very differently from the ancient Greeks who first told it. Far more chaotic than Hermes was his son, Pan. Half man and half goat, Pan lived far from the polished halls of Olympus. He preferred forests, mountains, caves, and lonely pastures where shepherds watched over their flocks. As the god of shepherds, rustic music, and untamed wilderness, Pan represented instincts that civilization struggled to control. His romantic life reflected that perfectly. Pan developed an unfortunate habit of falling desperately in love with nymphs who wanted absolutely nothing to do with him. The best-known example is Syrinx. A devoted follower of Artemis, Syrinx valued her independence and rejected Pan's advances. He chased her through forests until she reached the banks of a river. Desperate to escape, she prayed to the river nymphs for help. Just as Pan reached out to grasp her, her body transformed into a cluster of hollow reeds. Disappointed but unwilling to leave empty-handed, Pan cut several reeds and bound them together into a musical instrument. The pan flute, still bearing his name today, became both a symbol of pastoral music and a permanent reminder of love that could never be returned. Another story links Pan with Echo, the mountain nymph cursed to repeat only the final words spoken by others. Some later traditions claim Pan fell in love with her, but she rejected him. Enraged, he drove nearby shepherds into a frenzy, and they tore Echo apart. Gaia, the earth herself, preserved Echo's voice so it could continue repeating through valleys and mountains forever. Even the word panic comes from Pan. Ancient Greeks believed sudden, irrational fear in lonely wilderness was caused by the god's unseen presence. A traveller walking peacefully through the woods might suddenly feel overwhelming terror for no visible reason. That, they believed, was Pan at work. Together, Hermes and Pan reveal two very different faces of desire. Hermes relied on wit, charm, and transformation, while Pan embodied raw instinct, untouched by social rules. Between them, they reminded the Greeks that love could be clever, awkward, creative, frightening, or hopelessly one-sided. In mythology, even the quietest forest could become the setting for another unforgettable and often uncomfortable divine pursuit. No relationship in Greek mythology has generated more discussion than that of Hades and Persephone. Modern readers often view it as one of the darkest stories among the Olympians. Ancient audiences, however, often interpreted it quite differently, not necessarily as a romance, but as a myth explaining death, marriage, agriculture, and the changing of the seasons. Like many Greek myths, its meaning depends greatly on who is telling the story. The tale begins with Persephone, daughter of Demeter, goddess of agriculture. One peaceful day she wandered through a flowering meadow, gathering blossoms with her companions. Ancient poets describe the fields as overflowing with roses, violets, lilies, and narcissus, creating a scene of almost impossible beauty. Then the earth split open. From the darkness emerged Hades, ruler of the underworld, driving a magnificent black chariot pulled by immortal horses. Before Persephone could escape, Hades seized her and disappeared beneath the earth, carrying her into his shadowy kingdom. Unlike Zeus or Poseidon, Hades rarely appears pursuing numerous lovers. In Greek mythology, Persephone is essentially his only wife and queen. Yet the manner in which their marriage begins remains one of mythology's most controversial episodes. Complicating matters further is Zeus himself. According to the Homeric hymn to Demeter, Hades did not simply act alone. Zeus had secretly agreed to the marriage beforehand, without informing either Demeter or Persephone. To modern readers, this arrangement appears deeply disturbing. To many ancient Greeks, however, marriages were often negotiated between fathers and future husbands, rather than the bride herself. The myth reflects those social customs, even if it remains uncomfortable today. Demeter's reaction transformed the entire world. Heartbroken by her daughter's disappearance, she abandoned her divine duties. Crops withered, fields turned barren, trees stopped bearing fruit. Famine spread across the earth as humanity slowly faced extinction. Even Zeus eventually realized that hungry worshippers could no longer offer sacrifices to the gods. Something had to change. Hermes was sent to the underworld to negotiate Persephone's return. Hades agreed, but not before offering Persephone several pomegranate seeds. She ate them. It was a seemingly insignificant meal with enormous consequences. The Fates had established an ancient law. Anyone who consumed food in the underworld could never leave it forever. Since Persephone had eaten only a few seeds, usually 6 in later traditions, a compromise was reached. She would spend part of each year with Hades beneath the earth, and the remaining months reunited with Demeter. When Persephone returned to her mother, spring arrived. Flowers bloomed, fields turned green, harvests flourished. When she descended once again into the underworld, Demeter mourned, and autumn gradually gave way to winter. Later writers sometimes portrayed Persephone not as a helpless captive, but as a powerful queen who ruled beside Hades with confidence and authority. She judged souls, received heroes, and occasionally granted mercy or punishment. Unlike many Olympian marriages filled with constant infidelity, Hades and Persephone remained remarkably stable once the marriage had begun. Whether this should be interpreted as love, adaptation, or acceptance remains a question scholars continue to debate. Perhaps that uncertainty explains why the myth has endured for more than 2,000 years. It is simultaneously a story about marriage, power, grief, compromise, death, and renewal. Like the changing seasons themselves, it resists any single interpretation, reminding us that Greek mythology often asks difficult questions without offering simple answers. One aspect of Greek mythology that often surprises modern readers is how openly it includes same-sex relationships among gods and heroes. These stories were neither hidden nor treated as extraordinary. Instead, they existed alongside countless heterosexual romances, reflecting a society whose understanding of love and attraction differed significantly from modern ideas. That does not mean every relationship was viewed equally, nor that Greek society had no rules. Quite the opposite. Ancient Greece did not divide people into categories like gay, straight, or bisexual in the way modern cultures often do. Identity mattered less than social roles, age, status, and expectations. As a result, myths that seem straightforward today were understood very differently by ancient audiences. Perhaps the best-known divine example is Zeus and Ganymede. Ganymede was a prince of Troy, whose extraordinary beauty became famous throughout the world. Ancient poets described him as so handsome that even the king of the gods noticed him. Zeus decided he wanted the young prince on Olympus. Naturally, he chose one of his favourite methods of transportation. Transforming into a gigantic eagle, Zeus swooped down from the sky, seized Ganymede, and carried him to Mount Olympus. There, Ganymede was granted immortality and became the cupbearer of the gods, replacing Hebe in some versions of the myth. He poured nectar and ambrosia during divine banquets and remained forever young among the Olympians. Ancient artists depicted this story countless times on pottery, sculptures, and temple decorations, suggesting it was widely known rather than controversial. Apollo's relationship with Hyacinthus offers a gentler story. Unlike many divine pursuits, this one appears based on mutual affection. The two hunted together, competed in athletics, and shared a close companionship. Their happiness ended during a discus competition, when Hyacinthus was struck and killed. Some traditions describe it as an accident. Others blame the jealous west wind, Zephyrus, who redirected the discus because he too loved the Spartan prince. Unable to save him, Apollo transformed Hyacinthus's spilled blood into the flower that still bears his name. Another myth tells of Poseidon and Pelops. According to several ancient sources, Poseidon admired the young hero's beauty and carried him away to Olympus, where he taught him the art of driving divine chariots. Later, Pelops returned to the mortal world, becoming the legendary founder of the Peloponnese, the great southern peninsula of Greece. Not every famous Greek friendship should automatically be interpreted as romantic. Achilles and Patroclus provide perhaps the greatest example. In Homer's Iliad, their bond is portrayed as extraordinarily close, but Homer never explicitly describes them as lovers. Later Greek writers, however, including playwrights and philosophers, increasingly interpreted their relationship as romantic. By the classical period, many Athenians accepted them as devoted lovers, while others continued to see them primarily as inseparable companions. The differing interpretations remind us that mythology evolved constantly. What remains consistent throughout these stories is that love, admiration, and desire were not confined to a single pattern. The gods pursued beauty wherever they found it, whether in women, men, nymphs, or heroes. To the Greeks, beauty itself possessed an almost divine quality, capable of inspiring passion regardless of gender. Rather than fitting neatly into modern labels, these myths reflect an ancient world with its own customs, expectations, and contradictions, one where even the immortals followed rules very different from our own, yet remained driven by the same powerful force that shaped nearly every myth on Olympus: desire. If Greek mythology occasionally feels like everyone on Mount Olympus is related to everyone else, that is because they usually are. Unlike human families, divine genealogy rarely followed ordinary rules. Brothers married sisters, uncles became fathers-in-law, nieces married uncles. Generations overlapped until even the ancient Greeks occasionally needed elaborate family trees to keep track of who belonged to whom. It was less a family reunion than an immortal web of increasingly complicated introductions. The most famous example is Zeus and Hera. They were brother and sister, both children of the Titans Cronus and Rhea. Yet they were also husband and wife, ruling Olympus together after Zeus overthrew their father during the Great Titanomachy. To modern audiences, this relationship appears deeply unsettling. To the Greeks, however, it symbolized something quite different. The Olympians represented the original ruling family of the cosmos. By marrying within that divine family, they preserved the purity and authority of their celestial bloodline. Similar ideas appeared in several ancient civilizations, including Egypt, where royal sibling marriages sometimes served political and religious purposes. The gods, after all, were not expected to follow human customs. Their family tree continued in much the same fashion. Poseidon, Hades, Demeter, Hestia, and Hera were all Zeus's siblings. Zeus fathered children with Demeter, producing Persephone. He also fathered children with several titanesses, nymphs, and goddesses, creating a sprawling dynasty that governed nearly every aspect of the natural world. In some traditions, Aphrodite herself married her half-brother Hephaestus. The Olympians apparently believed awkward family dinners were simply unavoidable. Even earlier generations reveal similar patterns. Cronus married his own sister Rhea. Their parents, Uranus and Gaia, were both primordial beings, from whom much of existence itself emerged. In the earliest myths, concepts such as earth, sky, sea, and night were less individuals than living forces of creation. Their unions symbolize the formation of the universe rather than ordinary human relationships. Greek mythology also includes parent-child relationships that modern readers understandably find disturbing. One example concerns Myrrha, though she was mortal rather than divine. Cursed by Aphrodite, Myrrha unknowingly entered a relationship with her own father, King Cinyras. Horrified once the truth emerged, she fled and prayed for escape. The gods transformed her into the myrrh tree, from which the beautiful Adonis was later born. The story was never presented as desirable. Instead, ancient writers treated it as the result of a terrible divine curse and a warning about the destructive consequences of uncontrolled desire. Many myths involving unusual family relationships served symbolic rather than romantic purposes. The gods represented natural forces giving birth to other natural forces. Night produced sleep and death. Ocean produced thousands of rivers. Earth produced mountains, giants, and forests. Their unions reflected the Greeks' attempts to explain how every aspect of the universe emerged from a small number of primordial beings. Modern readers naturally judge these stories through contemporary ethics, while the ancient Greeks viewed them through the lens of cosmology and divine symbolism. That difference in perspective is essential. The Olympians were never meant to behave like ideal human families. They existed outside ordinary society, outside ordinary law, and often outside ordinary logic. Their tangled bloodlines emphasized one central idea: every force in the universe was connected. Unfortunately, that also meant nearly everyone on Olympus could claim to be someone else's sibling, spouse, cousin, parent, child, or in many cases, several of those at the same time. When immortal gods became involved with mortals, nymphs, monsters, or even one another, the result was not always another handsome Olympian. Sometimes it was Pegasus, sometimes it was a giant, sometimes it was a one-eyed Cyclops who considered sailors an acceptable afternoon snack. Greek mythology is filled with extraordinary creatures whose births were tied directly to the complicated relationships of the gods. To ancient audiences, these monsters were not random inventions. They explained why the world contained wonders, dangers, and places where ordinary rules no longer seem to apply. Perhaps the most famous example is Pegasus. After the hero Perseus beheaded Medusa, the winged horse burst from her severed neck alongside his brother Chrysaor. According to most traditions, both had been conceived when Poseidon united with Medusa, long before she became the terrifying Gorgon remembered today. Out of one of mythology's darkest stories emerged one of its most beautiful creatures. In a quiet valley where olive trees stretched toward the sea and clay dust settled over every rooftop by evening, there stood a village known less for heroes than for its pottery. The people there shaped jars, cups, lamps, and amphorae that eventually found their way to markets from Corinth to distant islands. It was honest work, if not particularly glamorous. Few poets ever composed verses about well-balanced storage vessels, despite the fact that civilizations had a remarkable tendency to collapse without them. Among the potters lived a young woman named Thalia. daughter of the village's finest craftsman. She had inherited her father's steady hands but not his broad shoulders, making it considerably harder to wrestle stubborn lumps of clay into obedience. Still, she possessed a gift that even experienced artisans admired. Every vessel she shaped seemed almost alive, decorated with graceful vines, dancing dolphins, or delicate roses that looked ready to bloom from the baked earth itself. Thalea's beauty was pleasant enough, though no bard would have declared ships ready to sail because of it. She wore simple linen dresses stained with reddish clay, kept her dark hair tied back while she worked, and spent far more time repairing cracked kiln bricks than gazing into polished bronze mirrors. If someone complimented her appearance, she usually assumed they were being polite before asking if they wanted another drinking cup. She preferred certainty. Clay behaved according to rules. Add too much water, and it collapsed. Fire it too quickly, and it cracked. Patience rewarded careful hands. Love, by comparison, appeared to follow no sensible laws whatsoever. She had watched neighbours become hopelessly enchanted with handsome fishermen who vanished with the next favourable wind. She had seen wealthy merchants abandon faithful wives for younger beauties, whose conversations rarely ventured beyond expensive perfumes. Even the gods seemed inconsistent. Zeus collected romances the way collectors gathered rare coins, while Hera responded with the sort of anger that made ordinary family disagreements seem refreshingly civilized. Thalea quietly concluded that affection was best admired from a comfortable distance. Her father occasionally suggested she consider marriage. "There is young Damon," he would mention while loading pottery into a cart. "Strong fellow. Owns 3 donkeys. I already have one stubborn creature to care for," she would answer, nodding toward the family mule. Her father could never tell whether she meant the mule or him. As fortune or perhaps divine amusement would have it, that year marked the 50th since the last great festival of Aphrodite's veil. The celebration occurred so rarely that no living villager remembered witnessing it. Grandparents recalled only stories told by their own grandparents, embroidered over decades until nobody could distinguish memory from myth. According to tradition, Aphrodite herself walked among mortals during the festival. Not in radiant splendour, not surrounded by doves or seashells. Instead, she arrived disguised as an elderly woman wearing faded robes and carrying nothing more remarkable than a walking staff. She observed. She listened. And before dawn ended the celebration, she gifted a crimson veil to one unmarried woman. The stories claimed the veil transformed its wearer into the most desired woman in all Greece. Kings sought her hand. Poets exhausted entire forests writing verses in her honour. Artists begged to paint her face. Warriors crossed mountains merely to hear her speak. The blessing seemed almost too generous. Naturally, it wasn't entirely a blessing. Old storytellers always lowered their voices before revealing the final part. The veil granted endless admiration, but it quietly stole the ability to recognize genuine love. Every smile appeared sincere. Every promise sounded true. Every admirer looked equally devoted. In a sea of endless desire, real affection became impossible to distinguish from ordinary obsession. Most listeners dismissed the warning. After all, who would complain about being adored by everyone? Like many gifts from Olympus, the true price remained invisible until long after it had been accepted. The journey to Cyprus took nearly 2 weeks, though the stories made it seem much shorter. Stories have always enjoyed skipping over sore feet, sunburned noses, and the unpleasant reality that ancient roads contained far more dust than romance. Thalea travelled beside her father in a small caravan of merchants and pilgrims heading toward the island. Their wagon creaked beneath stacks of carefully wrapped pottery destined for the festival markets. Every evening they stopped beside streams or olive groves, sharing bread, olives, goat cheese, and whatever fish could be persuaded to cooperate with the local fishermen. As they travelled south, the roads grew steadily busier. Young women dressed in bright white robes laughed together as they walked, each secretly wondering if fate had chosen her. Mothers adjusted daughters' hair every few minutes, convinced that divine intervention somehow depended upon neat braids. Fathers pretended not to be anxious while quietly calculating how impressive a son-in-law a goddess might provide. The conversations always returned to the same question. What if she chooses you? No one asked what happened afterward. People rarely questioned miracles before receiving them. By the time Thaleia reached Cyprus, the harbour city had transformed into something that barely resembled ordinary life. Crimson banners hung between marble columns, musicians filled every street with cheerful melodies, and fragrant smoke drifted upward from hundreds of small altars dedicated to Aphrodite. The air smelled of roses, cinnamon, roasted lamb, sea salt, and far too many competing perfumes. Merchants shouted over one another. Jewels worthy of the goddess. Fresh figs. Love charms guaranteed to work, or at least very decorative. Street performers danced while children chased white doves released for the celebration. Priests carried baskets overflowing with flower petals, while poets wandered about hoping someone wealthy would pay to hear another ode, comparing love to inconveniently dramatic weather. Thalia simply watched. Everything seemed louder than home, brighter, faster. She found herself missing the quiet rhythm of a spinning potter's wheel. That evening, as the sun slipped into the sea, thousands gathered before Aphrodite's magnificent temple. Torches illuminated towering marble columns, making them glow like pale gold against the darkening sky. The high priestess stepped onto the temple stairs. Her silver hair caught the firelight as she addressed the enormous crowd. "Tonight," she declared, "Our Lady walks among us." An immediate hush settled across the square. Every eye searched the crowd. Every elderly woman suddenly attracted remarkable attention. Young men hurried to offer seats. Young women handed out bread and water. Even notoriously stingy merchants became unexpectedly generous. Apparently, the possibility of accidentally insulting a disguised goddess was an excellent cure for miserliness. Among the hundreds of elderly faces stood one woman unlike the others. She wore faded grey robes patched many times over. Her sandals were worn nearly smooth. She leaned upon a twisted olive wood staff and carried a small woven basket that appeared completely empty. Most people barely noticed her. Those who did smiled politely before rushing away to seek someone who looked more divine. Only Thaleia paused. Without a word, she stepped forward and offered the old woman a small cup she had shaped herself from Arcadian clay. "It isn't much," she said gently, "but a traveller should never arrive empty-handed." The old woman accepted the gift with an unusually warm smile. For a brief moment, her weathered eyes seemed impossibly young, reflecting the moonlight like calm water. Then she quietly asked a question that no one else could hear. "Tell me, child, if every heart in Greece belonged to you, would you know which one was worth keeping?" Thaleia hesitated before answering the old woman's question. "If every heart in Greece belonged to me," she said after a thoughtful pause, "I think I would only want one." The old woman tilted her head. "And how would you choose?" Thaleia smiled faintly. "The one that would still stay if I owned nothing." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Around them, the festival continued in joyous chaos. Musicians struck lively melodies on their lyres, dancers spun across the marble courtyard, and young couples exchanged hopeful glances that they imagined were wonderfully discreet. They were not. Ancient Greece had many achievements, but subtle flirting was rarely among them. The old woman chuckled softly. "A wise answer. I only repeated something my father says." Wise fathers are rarer than wise kings. With surprising steadiness for someone who appeared well past 80, the old woman reached into her empty basket. Thaleia frowned. She could have sworn it had contained nothing. Yet the woman's hand emerged holding a folded piece of crimson fabric. The veil shimmered beneath the torchlight. It was unlike any cloth Thaleia had ever seen. It seemed woven from silk, yet lighter than linen. Gold threads flowed through it like rays of sunrise crossing calm water. Tiny embroidered roses appeared to bloom and fade as the fabric shifted in the evening breeze. The air itself grew strangely still. The music faded. Even the sea seemed quieter. The old woman's bent back slowly straightened. The wrinkles upon her face softened. Her grey robes glowed with gentle light. The wooden staff blossomed with white flowers. Gasps rippled across the temple courtyard. One by one, people fell to their knees. The elderly traveller had vanished. Standing before them now was Aphrodite herself. Her beauty was impossible to measure, because it seemed to become whatever each person believed beauty should be. Some later claimed her hair shone like molten gold. Others swore it was darker than midnight. Several poets spent decades arguing over the exact colour of her eyes, accomplishing remarkably little besides exhausting fresh supplies of ink. The goddess smiled at Thaleia. "You offered kindness before knowing who received it." She gently placed the crimson veil into the young woman's hands. "Accept this gift." Thaleia instinctively bowed. "My lady, I am honoured. You believe this is a blessing." "It is, isn't it?" Aphrodite's smile lingered, though sadness briefly touched her expression. "Every gift carries the shape of the one who receives it." The words puzzled Thaleia before she could fully understand them. The veil settled across her shoulders almost by itself. The fabric felt cool for only a heartbeat. Then warmth spread through her body like sunlight after winter rain. She felt lighter, more confident, as though every insecurity she had ever carried had quietly drifted away. Around her the crowd stared, not with ordinary admiration, with overwhelming fascination. A young nobleman dropped the jewelled goblet he had been holding. A visiting Spartan forgot the sentence he had been speaking halfway through. Two brothers who had been arguing over horse prices suddenly stopped and looked only at Thaleia. Even the musicians missed several notes before realizing they had completely forgotten the song. Thaleia noticed none of it. She simply smiled, believing the festival had become unusually friendly. High above the temple, Aphrodite watched silently. Beside her, invisible to mortal eyes, stood Eros. "The lesson begins?" the young god asked. Aphrodite nodded. "Yes." Eros looked down at the smiling potter's daughter. "Will she hate you for this?" The goddess watched as dozens of strangers unconsciously stepped toward Thaleia. "I hope," Aphrodite whispered. "She learns before she does." The following morning, Thaleia discovered that life had become unexpectedly complicated. She noticed it before breakfast. The baker, who had previously sold bread with the cheerful efficiency of a man who believed flour solved most problems, refused to accept payment. "For you," he said with an awkward smile. "Never." "I insist." "So do I." He handed her 2 warm loaves, several honey cakes, and a small jar of olive paste. "I only asked for one loaf." "I know." She walked away thoroughly confused. By the time she reached the market square, matters had become considerably stranger. A jeweller offered her a necklace of polished amber. A fisherman insisted she accept the largest tuna from his morning catch. A shepherd presented her with a perfectly healthy lamb. A poet dramatically announced that her smile had rescued the sun from the boredom of eternity, which was certainly imaginative, if somewhat unfair to the sun. Thalia politely declined every gift. People simply found new gifts to offer. Before noon, she owned 3 bouquets of roses, 2 embroidered shawls, a silver bracelet, 6 pomegranates, and 1 surprisingly affectionate goat that someone claimed was too lonely without her. She had absolutely no idea what to do with the goat. The festival buzzed with whispers. The goddess chose her. Look at her. I've never seen anyone so beautiful. Even those who had met Thalia the day before spoke as though she had somehow transformed overnight. When she glanced into a polished bronze mirror hanging outside a merchant's stall, however, she saw the same face she had always known. Dark hair, brown eyes, a faint streak of clay still beneath one fingernail. Nothing extraordinary. She touched the crimson veil resting lightly upon her shoulders. Perhaps the beauty everyone described wasn't something mirrors could capture. By afternoon, the number of admirers had become impossible to ignore. A wealthy merchant from Athens offered to build her a villa overlooking the sea. A young Spartan promised eternal protection, though his speech contained almost as many references to military discipline as affection. A sailor claimed he would sail to the edge of Oceanus itself if she merely smiled at him once each morning. One elderly philosopher attempted to explain mathematically why destiny had clearly selected them for one another. His calculations remained unconvincing. Thalia thanked each man kindly before refusing. None accepted her answer. Instead, they smiled with renewed determination, convinced persistence would eventually succeed. Apparently rejection had become merely an interesting obstacle. Her father watched the spectacle with increasing concern. "This isn't normal," he muttered. "No," Thalia admitted. "But they all seem nice." "Do they?" She looked across the marketplace. Dozens of men waited for an opportunity to speak with her. Several were glaring at one another. One had already challenged another to a wrestling match over who deserved the privilege of walking beside her. Neither contestant appeared to realize she had never invited either of them. "They're only excited," Thalia said. Her father frowned. "They aren't looking at you." She blinked. "What do you mean?" "They're looking at what they want." The words lingered in the warm afternoon air. For the first time, Thalia truly studied the faces surrounding her. Every smile seemed sincere. Every compliment sounded heartfelt. Every promise carried equal conviction. Yet somehow, despite hearing hundreds of declarations of admiration, she realized she remembered almost nothing about the people speaking them. They praised her beauty. They praised her grace. They praised her smile. No one asked about her pottery. No one asked what made her laugh. No one asked whether she preferred the mountains or the sea. She suddenly felt strangely alone, invisible beneath endless attention. High above Olympus, Aphrodite watched in silence. The veil had begun weaving its lesson. Not by making love impossible, but by allowing desire to become so loud that everything quieter could no longer be heard. The days following the festival became a strange parade of impossible devotion. Every village Thalia passed through seemed to know her name before she arrived. Word spread faster than merchant caravans. The woman chosen by Aphrodite, the keeper of the crimson veil, the most beautiful maiden in Greece. Each storyteller added another embellishment. By the time the tale reached northern Thessaly, one version claimed dolphins had carried her across the sea while roses bloomed wherever she stepped. The dolphins, had anyone bothered to consult them, would likely have denied the accusation. Returning home proved almost impossible. Every roadside inn was crowded with men hoping to glimpse her. Travellers conveniently chose the same roads. Farmers suddenly found urgent reasons to deliver grain to villages they had never previously visited. One local magistrate even proposed renaming the village square in her honour, before anyone remembered she had been gone for less than 3 weeks. Her father sighed often. "I miss when people wanted my pottery. They still do. They only buy it because you touched it." Unfortunately, he was right. The simplest clay cup now sold for prices that would once have purchased an entire kiln. Collectors claimed her fingerprints possessed divine favour. One particularly enthusiastic nobleman asked whether she would consider touching his entire vineyard. Thalia politely declined. She was beginning to understand that admiration could become exhausting. One quiet afternoon, seeking escape from another gathering of admirers outside her father's workshop, she carried a basket of unfired bowls toward a nearby stream. The path wound through olive trees and wildflowers, finally opening into a peaceful clearing where only birds disturbed the silence. At last. No speeches, no poetry, no marriage proposals, only running water. She knelt beside the stream and carefully rinsed the fresh clay. That was when she noticed someone else. A young sculptor sat beneath an old cypress tree several yards away. His clothes were dusty with marble powder. A half-finished statue rested beside him. Unlike every other man she had met since receiving the veil, he did not stare. In fact, he barely looked at her at all. He remained entirely focused on repairing a broken stone hand that had snapped from his sculpture. Curious, Thalia approached. "I'm sorry," she said. "Am I disturbing you?" The sculptor glanced up briefly. "Not unless you know how to fix marble." She smiled. "I'm afraid I only work with clay." "Clay forgives mistakes. Does marble?" "No." He returned to his work. The conversation simply ended. It was the shortest discussion she had enjoyed in weeks. "You aren't going to ask my name?" she asked. "I assumed you'd tell me if it mattered." "You don't recognize me?" "I've been working." "You haven't heard about Aphrodite's festival?" "I've heard enough shouting from the road to know something dramatic happened." His answer surprised her. Everyone else seemed fascinated before she even introduced herself. "You really don't know who I am?" He studied her for a moment. "You seem like someone carrying too much attention." Then he looked back at the broken statue. Nothing more. For reasons she couldn't explain, disappointment crept into her chest. She had grown so accustomed to admiration that its absence felt strangely uncomfortable. Wasn't that odd? She wanted to continue talking, yet his quiet indifference unsettled her. The veil whispered silently within her heart. Surely this man wasn't important. Surely the dozens of princes, generals, poets, and wealthy merchants adored her more deeply. As she walked away, she glanced back once. The sculptor never noticed, or perhaps he simply chose not to. Far above the mortal world, Eros looked toward Aphrodite. He sees her. "Yes," the goddess answered softly, "but she cannot yet see him." Thalia tried not to think about the sculptor. She told herself his indifference meant nothing. After all, why should the opinion of one quiet craftsman matter when half of Greece seemed eager to win her affection? The answer, unfortunately, refused to remain quiet. Days passed, and the crowds only grew larger. Messengers arrived carrying invitations from noble families. One lord offered vineyards stretching farther than the eye could see. Another promised to build her a palace overlooking the Corinthian Gulf. A famous poet dedicated an entire collection of verses to her before discovering she had never actually spoken more than 3 sentences to him. The poems were very flattering. They were also about someone who did not exist. According to the verses, she laughed like morning birds, danced beneath every full moon, and spent her evenings singing beside the sea. In reality, Thaleia preferred repairing cracked water jars while quietly humming whatever tune happened to drift into her head. She couldn't dance particularly well. Birds usually ignored her, and she had always been slightly afraid of deep water. Yet nobody seemed interested in those details. Every admirer loved an idea. Very few wished to know the woman herself. One afternoon, while helping her father fire a new batch of pottery, she accidentally ruined an amphora. The clay had dried unevenly, and a long crack appeared as the vessel cooled. Normally she would sigh, laugh at her mistake, and begin again. Instead, several young men rushed forward. "It wasn't your fault. The kiln betrayed you. The clay was clearly inferior. We'll buy it anyway. It's perfect because you made it." Thaleia stared at the cracked vessel. "It isn't perfect. It is to us." Their answers came so quickly that she wondered if they had even looked at the pottery. Her father quietly carried the broken amphora aside. Later, while sweeping fragments into a basket, he spoke without looking at her. "Do you remember when I taught you to shape clay?" She nodded. "You made me crush my first bowl." "I made you crush 12. I cried. "You did? Why?" He smiled gently. "Because I wanted you to love good work more than praise." The words settled heavily between them. Outside the workshop, another group of admirers had gathered. Someone was singing beneath the window. Someone else had arrived with flowers. A wealthy merchant argued with a soldier over whose gift should be presented first. None of them had seen the cracked amphora. None of them would have admitted it existed. That evening, unable to bear the constant attention, Thaleia slipped away to the same quiet stream where she had met the sculptor. He was there again. This time he sat chiselling the face of a marble figure illuminated by the soft orange light of sunset. She approached cautiously. "You came back?" Without looking up, he answered, "It's where I work. I thought perhaps you'd gone. The statue isn't finished." She watched him carefully remove another tiny fragment of stone. "You spend hours shaping one face." "So?" "My father says clay remembers every touch." The sculptor smiled for the first time. "My teacher used to say marble remembers every mistake." Long before the first Greek sailor trusted his life to the sea, before marble temples crowned lonely hills, and before poets argued endlessly about whether love or war made better verses, another river flowed in silence beneath the world. It was the river Styx. Its waters were darker than moonless nights, and older than memory itself. No wind disturbed its surface. No birds flew above it. The river did not rage like a mountain torrent, nor sparkle beneath the sun. It simply flowed, endlessly carrying every soul from the world of the living toward the kingdom of Hades. At its lonely shore waited Charon. The ferryman had rowed his weathered boat across those black waters for thousands upon thousands of years. No one remembered when he had first taken hold of his worn wooden oar. Even the Olympian gods spoke of him with unusual respect, for there were few beings in existence who had served their duty longer. Charon rarely spoke. Some believed he had forgotten how. Others claimed he knew every secret ever whispered by dying men, and had simply decided silence was kinder. The dead approached him carrying a single coin beneath their tongues, or placed upon their eyes by grieving families. Those who arrived without payment wandered the riverbank for 100 years before crossing. Ancient customs, much like taxes, were remarkably difficult to avoid. Yet there was one secret the world had never discovered. Charon was not alone. Hidden among the quiet caves carved into the riverbank lived his daughter, Neris. Few could have guessed such a lonely figure even possessed a family. Neris herself had never known her mother. Charon never spoke of her, though sometimes, when the river became perfectly still, he would quietly gaze toward the distant darkness beyond the Styx. His daughter learned long ago that certain silences should remain undisturbed. Unlike her father, Neris possessed warmth that seemed strangely out of place in the underworld. She greeted frightened souls with gentle smiles. She offered comforting words to children too young to understand death. She sat beside lonely old men who feared being forgotten. She listened patiently to warriors still believing they had one more battle to fight. The journey across the Styx lasted only a few moments. Acceptance often required far longer. That became Neris's task. She did not judge. She did not promise impossible reunions. She simply helped wandering souls release the weight they still carried from life. Sometimes all they needed was someone willing to listen. Over the centuries, she heard countless final regrets. I should have forgiven my brother. I worked too much. I never told her. If only I had one more spring. The words changed. The sadness rarely did. One evening, as pale blue mist drifted across the silent river, Charon finished guiding another boat to shore. Without speaking, he handed his daughter a small lantern burning with ghostly silver flame. She accepted it with a quiet nod. The lantern's light never illuminated the path ahead. Instead, it revealed hearts still struggling to let go. It was a gift no Olympian possessed. For even among the dead, compassion could guide where power never could. And before the next moon had completed its journey across the heavens, that quiet compassion would alter the oldest law of the underworld forever. In the underworld, time did not pass as it did beneath the sun. There were no dawns to greet the living, no sunsets to mark the end of labour, and no changing seasons to remind the dead that another year had quietly slipped away. The river Styx flowed with the same patient rhythm it had known since the world was young, carrying kings and shepherds, queens and beggars, philosophers and thieves with perfect indifference. Death, after all, was the fairest judge Greece had ever produced. Neris had welcomed thousands of souls across the centuries. Some arrived peacefully, relieved that long illnesses had finally ended. Others still believed they were dreaming. Warriors often reached for swords, no longer hanging at their sides. Children usually searched for their parents. The old almost always searched for memories. Every soul carried something invisible. Fear, regret, hope, sometimes all three. On this particular evening, Charon's boat emerged once more from the mist, gliding silently toward the black shore. As always, the ferryman climbed onto the bank without speaking. Behind him stood only one passenger, a young man. His clothes were simple, stained with dust from long roads and faded ink upon his sleeves. A weathered leather satchel still rested across one shoulder, although whatever scrolls it had once carried were now gone. He could not have seen more than 25 summers. Yet unlike nearly every soul Neris had ever met, he showed no fear. Instead, he was humming. The melody drifted softly across the silent river. It was unfinished. The tune wandered gracefully before suddenly stopping, as though searching for words that no longer existed. Neris paused. Music rarely crossed the sticks. Most souls were too frightened to sing. The young man noticed her listening. "I'm sorry," he said with an embarrassed smile. "I keep trying to remember the ending." "The ending?" "My poem." He tapped his forehead gently. "I finished most of it, but not all." Neris tilted her head. "You remember a poem after death?" "I remember needing to finish it." She had never heard anyone say such a thing. People begged for another conversation with family, another embrace, another sunrise, another chance to correct mistakes. No one had ever wished to return simply to complete a song. "What is your name?" she asked. "Lysandros." "And you were a poet?" He laughed quietly. "I hope to become one. There is a difference. I sold olive oil." That answer surprised her. "I only wrote during the evenings." He looked toward the black water. "I finally created something worth remembering." His smile slowly faded. "And then I died before writing the final verses." Silence settled between them. Finally, almost absent-mindedly, Lysandros began singing again. His voice was gentle, not powerful, not trained, but every word carried remarkable sincerity. He sang of fishermen watching dawn appear across quiet seas, of old mothers waiting at cottage doors, of lovers growing grey together rather than remaining forever young. He celebrated ordinary life, the kind of life that poets often overlooked while chasing heroes and kings. The melody echoed across the sticks. Even the restless spirits waiting upon the riverbank became still. Neris felt something unfamiliar stir within her heart. Not pity, not sorrow, possibility. The song reached its final verse. Lysandros opened his mouth. Nothing came. The ending had vanished with his last breath. "I almost had it," he whispered. "I was so close." For the first time in centuries, Neris looked not toward the shores of the dead, but toward the distant world of the living. A dangerous thought entered her mind. Perhaps one unfinished life deserved one final mourning. For the first time in centuries, Neris could not concentrate. She remained beside the river long after Karen had carried the last soul of the evening across the sticks. The silver lantern still glowed softly in her hands, but its familiar light no longer calmed her thoughts. Lysandros sat quietly upon the black shore. He did not complain. He did not beg. He simply stared toward the distant ceiling of the underworld, where no stars had ever shone. "I almost remember it," he whispered. "The ending?" He nodded. "It comes close." He tapped his chest gently. Then disappears again. Neris had heard countless regrets over the ages. Men wished they had spoken kinder words. Queens regretted unnecessary wars. Children longed for one last embrace. But this felt different. Lysandros did not fear death itself. He feared leaving beauty unfinished. She remembered every story Karen had ever silently taught her. The oldest law of the underworld was simple. No soul crossed the river Styx twice. Not toward life. Never. The balance between worlds depended upon that single rule. Without it, death would become nothing more than an inconvenient interruption. Even the Olympians respected that boundary. Only a handful had ever challenged it. Few had escaped the consequences. Neris looked toward her father. Karen stood beside his weathered boat exactly as he always did, motionless, silent. His face revealed nothing. Yet somehow she sensed he understood every thought racing through her mind. "I know," she whispered. He neither nodded nor shook his head. Instead, he slowly pushed the boat away from the shore. He was leaving, trusting her alone. The quiet frightened her more than any warning could have. Hours passed. The river flowed endlessly through the darkness. Finally, Neris approached the old ferry. She untied its ancient rope. The wood groaned softly beneath her hands. Lysandros looked up in confusion. "What are you doing?" She climbed into the boat. "Get in." His eyes widened. "No. You know where this leads?" "I do." "You cannot." "I can." "The laws?" "I know the laws." He remained frozen. "If Hades discovers this, he will. You'll be punished." "Probably." Lysandros lowered his head. "I cannot ask this of you. You didn't." For the first time since she had known him, Neris smiled. "You simply wrote an unfinished song." He climbed into the boat reluctantly. The moment he stepped aboard, the river Styx reacted. Its perfectly calm surface began to ripple. Black water circled the ferry. The silver lantern dimmed. Far away, deep within the palace of Hades, enormous bronze bells begin ringing by themselves. 1, 2, 3. Every spirit along the riverbank lifted its head. The underworld had noticed. Neris gripped the ancient oar. It was heavier than she expected. The wood felt impossibly old, polished smooth by countless centuries of Charon's hands. She pushed against the dark water. The boat moved, not toward the kingdom of the dead, toward the distant shore where moonlight still existed. As they crossed, the darkness slowly began to thin. Cold mist gave way to pale silver light. For the first time since dying, Lysandros smelled pine trees, sea air, rain, the living world. The eastern horizon glowed with the first hint of approaching dawn. When the boat touched the earthly shore, Neris stepped onto living soil for the first time in her existence. She helped Lysandros climb onto the riverbank. His breathing returned. Colour slowly filled his face. His heartbeat echoed through the silent forest. He was alive. For one beautiful, impossible moment, both simply stood there listening to birds greet the morning. Then the ground trembled. The air grew colder. Behind them, the waters of the Styx began flowing backward. A deep voice rolled across both worlds like distant thunder. "Neris!" The trees bent. The sky darkened. Even the moon seemed to hesitate. Hades had awakened. The forest fell silent. Birdsong vanished. The morning breeze stopped moving through the pine branches, and even the waves along the distant shore seemed to hesitate, as though the world itself feared what was coming. Dark mist gathered around the place where Neris had stepped from the boat. It spread across the ground like spilled ink, creeping over roots and stones until the entire clearing disappeared beneath a blanket of shadow. The sunlight remained above, but it no longer reached the earth. The king of the underworld had arrived. Hades did not emerge with roaring flames or crashing thunder. He appeared the way winter arrives across a valley, slowly, inevitably, leaving no doubt that resistance would accomplish absolutely nothing. His robes flowed like midnight. A crown of black iron rested upon his head. Behind him stretched the endless silence of the realm he governed, where every soul eventually arrived regardless of wealth, fame, beauty, or particularly optimistic travel plans. Unlike many tales told by frightened mortals, Hades was neither cruel nor bloodthirsty. He was something far more intimidating. He was fair. Fairness leaves remarkably little room for negotiation. His gaze settled first upon Lysandros. The young poet had regained the warmth of life. Colour had returned to his face, and his heart once again beat beneath his ribs. He belonged among the living. He should not. The king then turned toward Neris. She lowered her head. There were no excuses worth offering. She had knowingly broken the oldest law of the underworld, not through anger, not through pride, simply through compassion. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence carried more weight than any accusation. Far behind Hades, another figure quietly appeared beside the black river, Charon. The ferryman remained perfectly still, one weathered hand resting upon his ancient oar. He neither defended his daughter, nor condemned her. His duty had always required silence. Today was no different. Finally, Hades raised one hand. The shadows surrounding the clearing shifted. Within them appeared countless ghostly images from ages long past. Orpheus descending in search of Eurydice. Heracles dragging Cerberus toward daylight. Sisyphus cheating death. Mortals and gods alike attempting to outwit the balance between life and death. Every story ended the same way. Balance always returned. The images faded. Neris understood the lesson immediately. The law existed not because the gods lacked mercy, but because without it, neither world could survive. If every unfinished dream justified another chance, the river Styx would cease to separate anything at all. The dead would wander endlessly. The living would never truly live. Even grief would lose its meaning. Hades finally spoke. His voice resembled distant stone doors opening after centuries of silence. There would be no punishment born from anger, only consequence. The balance had been disturbed by one soul returning to life. One soul, therefore, had to return willingly before the next full moon completed its cycle. Neris herself would restore what she had broken. If she failed, she would inherit her father's place forever. Charon would finally leave the river after thousands of endless years. The sentence echoed through both worlds. The king of the underworld disappeared as quietly as he had come. The shadows dissolved. Morning sunlight returned. Birds cautiously began singing again. Lysandros looked toward the bright horizon, grateful simply to breathe. Neris looked toward the fading outline of the Styx. For the first time in her immortal life, she had been given a deadline. 30 nights. One impossible choice. And somewhere beneath the same moon, Destiny had already begun composing the final verse of the poet's unfinished song. The moon rose that evening like a silver coin suspended above the mountains. Its pale light marked the beginning of Neris's sentence. 30 nights. By the next full moon, the balance between life and death had to be restored. If not, Charon's endless duty would become hers, and the ferryman who had guided souls since the dawn of memory would finally step away from the river Styx. For the first time in centuries, Neris remained in the world above instead of returning beneath it. Everything fascinated her. The underworld possessed no changing seasons, but here the earth seemed alive with constant movement. Pine trees whispered whenever the wind passed through their branches. Streams glittered beneath sunlight. Clouds drifted lazily across enormous blue skies that seemed impossibly vast compared with the cavernous darkness she had always known. Even silence sounded different. It carried birdsong, crickets, distant waves, the quiet breathing of sleeping villagers. The living world never truly rested. Lysandros guided her through the countryside toward his small hometown overlooking the Aegean Sea. They avoided crowded roads, travelling instead through olive groves, vineyards, and narrow mountain paths where only shepherds occasionally crossed their way. Neris watched everything with quiet wonder. Children laughed while chasing one another between fig trees. Old women hung fresh laundry beneath the sun. Farmers argued cheerfully over stubborn oxen that clearly believed ploughing fields was someone else's responsibility. She smiled at nearly everything she saw. Death had taught her the value of ordinary mornings. Life itself appeared miraculous. Lysandros, meanwhile, carried a wax writing tablet wherever they travelled. Every few hours he stopped beneath a tree or beside a stream, carefully writing another few lines of his unfinished poem. His memories returned slowly, not all at once. Sometimes an entire verse appeared effortlessly. Other days he recovered only a single sentence. Neris noticed that the poem had changed. Before his death, it had celebrated beautiful places. Now it celebrated beautiful moments. The difference was subtle. Yet somehow it made the verses feel deeper. One afternoon they reached a hill overlooking the sea. Lysandros quietly read several completed passages aloud. He described fishermen returning safely before storms, parents teaching children old songs, neighbours repairing broken roofs together after winter winds. None of it involved famous heroes. None of it praised glorious battles. It simply honoured lives that history rarely bothered to remember. Neris understood why the song had moved her. She had welcomed countless souls into the underworld. Most had not been kings. Most had simply loved their families, worked honestly, and hoped someone would remember their names after they were gone. Lysandros had somehow written about all of them. As the days passed, Neris found herself forgetting the deadline waiting beneath the next full moon. She laughed more easily. She asked endless questions about vineyards, marketplaces, festivals, and the strange custom of people arguing passionately over whose goat had eaten whose vegetables. Apparently, mortality did little to reduce humanity's talent for creating surprisingly specific disputes. Yet every sunset reminded her of the truth. Far below the earth, the river Styx still flowed. Each evening, the silver lantern Charon had given her flickered faintly inside her travelling satchel. Its ghostly flame grew weaker with every passing night. The balance was beginning to fail. Somewhere beneath the world, restless souls were already waiting longer than they should. Time, even in matters of eternity, was quietly running out. By the 20th night, the moon had grown noticeably rounder. Neris no longer needed to count the days. The sky counted them for her. Each evening, the silver lantern glowed a little more faintly, its once steady flame shrinking until it resembled the final ember of a dying fire. It had always guided frightened souls toward peace, but now its light flickered uncertainly, as though it could no longer decide which world it truly belonged to. Far beneath the earth, something else had begun to change. The river Styx no longer flowed with its ancient calm. Souls gathered along its shores in greater numbers than ever before. The newly dead arrived from every corner of Greece, old fishermen claimed by winter storms, shepherds buried beneath falling rocks, children taken by fever, soldiers who would never see home again. Normally, Charon ferried them across without delay. Now the crossings grew slower. The ferryman had been forced to work alone. Without Neris welcoming the lost and easing their fears, frightened spirits lingered on the shore, unable to release the lives they had left behind. The line stretched farther each day. The silence of the underworld had become crowded. Even Hades watched without speaking. Meanwhile, in the world above, Lysandros had nearly completed his poem. Only the final verse remained. He carried the wax tablets everywhere, reading the growing work aloud whenever inspiration arrived. Villagers welcomed him warmly, believing they were witnessing a man who had survived a terrible illness, rather than someone who had quietly crossed death itself. Neris listened each evening. The poem no longer belonged solely to him. It belonged to every ordinary soul she had ever guided across the Styx. It honoured mothers whose names had faded from memory, old craftsmen whose finest work outlived them, children remembered only by their parents, farmers who measured success not by glory but by healthy harvests. Heroes filled monuments. Ordinary people filled the world. For the first time, Neris understood why the unfinished song had troubled her so deeply beneath the river. It reminded the living that greatness was not the only life worth remembering. One afternoon, while walking through a small coastal village, they came upon a funeral procession. An elderly woman had died peacefully in her sleep. Her family carried olive branches and simple flowers, following the modest wooden bier toward a hillside cemetery overlooking the sea. The mourners spoke softly. Some cried openly. Others simply held one another's hands. Neris watched from a distance. She could almost see the old woman's spirit lingering nearby, uncertain whether to remain with those she loved or continue toward the unseen river. Instinctively, Neris stepped forward. She whispered the same gentle words she had spoken to thousands before. No mortal heard them, yet the old woman's spirit smiled peacefully. Without fear, she turned away from the living and disappeared into the evening light. The silver lantern suddenly burned brighter. Only for a moment. Only briefly. But Neris understood. Even while walking among the living, she remained what she had always been, a guide, not someone who prevented death, someone who eased its path. That night she sat alone beneath the stars, staring toward the nearly full moon. For the first time since returning Lysandros to life, she allowed herself to consider the truth she had tried to avoid. The balance could not remain broken forever. Soon someone would have to cross the Styx. And this time, there would be no journey back. On the 29th night, the moon hung almost perfectly full above Greece. Its pale light washed across the sea, silvered the olive groves, and rested quietly upon the little village where Lysandros had spent nearly every waking hour writing. Only one verse remained unfinished. One final ending, one final choice. On the northern coast of Thessaly, where steep white cliffs overlooked the restless Aegean Sea, stood a small stone cottage, unlike any other in Greece. Its walls were plain. Its roof had weathered more winters than anyone cared to count. But from its open windows came fabrics so astonishingly delicate that merchants claimed they were lighter than flower petals drifting across spring meadows. The cottage belonged to Myrto. She was the daughter of weavers, the granddaughter of weavers, and according to village gossip, probably destined to marry another weaver if fate maintained its usual sense of irony. Yet Myrto possessed a talent that seemed to belong less to ordinary craftsmanship than to something quietly magical. She did not merely weave cloth. She studied movement, the flutter of gulls above crashing waves, the bending of wheat before distant storms, the way mist curled through mountain passes before dawn. Even the sea breeze fascinated he. Most people felt the wind. Myrto watched it. She often climbed the cliffs carrying bundles of coloured thread, fastening them to weathered olive branches before sitting for hours in complete silence. As the wind tugged and twisted the strands, she carefully sketched every movement onto wax tablets. Fishermen passing below often shook their heads. There she is again. Talking to the wind? No. Worse. Studying it. Ancient Greece admired philosophers who questioned the stars. People were considerably less enthusiastic about young women taking notes while staring at invisible air. Her father, however, never laughed. The loom teaches patience, he often reminded her. The wind teaches everything else." Those words remained with Myrto long after he passed away during one unusually harsh winter. She inherited not only his workshop, but also his greatest belief that every thread carried a story long before human hands ever touched it. Years passed. Her reputation spread from village to village. Nobles commissioned ceremonial robes. Temple priests requested sacred tapestries. Captains sailing across the Aegean paid extraordinary sums for cloaks light enough to withstand sea spray without growing heavy. One wealthy merchant proudly declared that wearing Myrto's work felt like being hugged by a particularly polite cloud. No one entirely understood what he meant. Everyone agreed it sounded expensive. Despite her growing fame, Myrto lived simply. She preferred quiet mornings beside her loom to crowded banquets. She spent more time collecting unusual fibres than polishing jewellery. Her greatest treasure remained an old wooden shuttle carved by her father decades earlier, worn smooth by countless hours of careful work. Yet something continued to trouble her. Every cloth she created eventually ended. The final thread always reached the edge of the loom. The masterpiece became complete. She wondered whether perfection existed beyond ordinary materials. Could someone weave sunlight? Could moonlight become fabric? Could rain become thread? Most dismissed such thoughts as impossible. Myrto did not. Each evening she stood upon the cliffs watching the northern wind race across the sea. It possessed shape without form, power without weight, freedom beyond anything human hands could create. She found herself imagining what no weaver had ever dared attempt. Not clothing woven against the wind, but clothing woven with it. High above the clouds, another pair of unseen eyes had begun watching the lonely workshop beside the cliffs. Boreas, the mighty north wind, laughed whenever he saw the determined young weaver chasing invisible currents with bundles of thread. Mortals had tried to predict him, pray to him, curse him. No one had ever attempted to understand him. Amused by her strange obsession, the ancient wind began visiting the cliffs more often, circling her cottage with playful gusts and sharp winter breezes. He believed he was only entertaining himself. He did not yet realize that every visit left behind another tiny clue. And Myrto never stopped learning. Winter arrived early that year. The sea turned the colour of hammered iron, and the waves hurled themselves against the cliffs with enough force to shake stones from the shoreline. Fishermen pulled their boats far above the tide, merchants delayed their voyages, and shepherds hurried their flocks into sheltered valleys before the first northern gales swept across Thessaly. Everyone cursed the coming storms. Everyone except Myrto. To her, winter was the greatest teacher a weaver could hope for. Every gust revealed a different pattern. Every storm carried its own rhythm. She spent hours standing upon the cliffs wrapped in heavy wool, watching ribbons tied to weathered branches dance wildly through the air. Some twisted in spirals, others snapped straight before suddenly curling back upon themselves. The wind never truly repeated a movement. It improvised. That fascinated her. Back inside her workshop, she covered wax tablets with endless sketches. Not drawings of cloth, drawings of motion. Visitors often stared at the strange designs without understanding them. There aren't any flowers. There aren't any gods. There aren't even any proper borders. Myrto only smiled. I am weaving something that has never existed. The loom dominating the centre of her workshop had belonged to her grandmother. Its oak frame groaned softly whenever she worked, as though remembering thousands of earlier creations. Upon it, she stretched threads unlike any she had used before. the finest mountain wool. Flax gathered beneath the first full moon of autumn. Silk traded from distant eastern merchants. Silver thread so thin it almost disappeared beneath candlelight. Every material served a purpose. Every thread occupied exactly the place she believed the wind itself would choose. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The unfinished cloak slowly grew across the loom. It shimmered strangely. Sometimes visitors believed the fabric moved even when every window remained closed. Other times they could have sworn it made the faint sound of distant waves. No one stayed long enough to decide whether they had imagined it. Far above the clouds, Boreas continued watching. The mighty north wind found the determined mortal endlessly amusing. He rushed around her workshop with playful gusts, rattled shutters during the night, and occasionally scattered baskets of freshly spun wool simply to see her sigh before patiently collecting every strand again. She never cursed him, never begged the gods for calmer weather. Instead, she adjusted her weaving. Every prank taught her something. Boreas laughed. No mortal had ever responded to him this way. One evening, as snow began falling across the cliffs, the wind god descended lower than ever before. Invisible to human eyes, he circled the cottage again and again, curious to see the nearly completed masterpiece. The workshop windows stood open despite the bitter cold. Candles flickered. The loom waited. As Boreas swept through the room in one powerful current, something impossible happened. The silver threads trembled, not because of the wind, because they answered it. For a single heartbeat, the fabric glowed with pale blue light. The rushing air no longer passed through the loom. It remained inside it. The workshop fell unnaturally still. Outside, the snowflakes drifted gently downward. Inside, the unfinished cloak stirred by itself, as though breathing. Far above Olympus, Aeolus suddenly looked towards northern Greece. One of his oldest winds had gone silent, and that had never happened before. Myrto did not realize she had changed the world. When morning arrived, she stepped outside carrying the finished cloak across her arms, expecting the familiar bite of the north wind against her face. Instead, nothing. The air stood perfectly still, not calm in the ordinary sense. Still, the grass upon the cliffs no longer swayed. The gulls hovered awkwardly before flapping their wings harder than usual, as though something invisible had stopped supporting them. Even the waves below seemed strangely gentle, rising and falling without their usual restless energy. She wrapped the cloak around her shoulders. It felt impossibly light. The fabric seemed almost weightless, yet pleasantly warm despite the winter morning. Tiny silver threads shimmered beneath the sunlight, and every now and then she thought she heard a faint whisper deep within the weave. It sounded remarkably like distant wind trapped inside a cave. She smiled. It worked. She did not fully understand why, only that she had somehow woven movement itself into cloth. Within days the change spread across Greece. Fishermen who normally waited anxiously for storms to pass discovered seas smoother than polished marble. Small boats crossed dangerous channels without fear. Families who had spent generations mourning sailors lost to sudden squalls began thanking every god they could name. Merchants celebrated even louder. Harbours that usually closed during winter remained busy. Cargo arrived safely. Insurance, had it existed, would have suffered a truly disastrous season. Word travelled quickly. The sea has become gentle. The storms are gone. The north wind has vanished. Some called it a miracle. Others called it the greatest blessing since Demeter had first taught humanity to grow grain. Travellers eventually traced every rumour back to the same lonely workshop upon the Thessalian cliffs. Visitors arrived in endless numbers. Captains begged Myrto to weave cloaks for entire crews. Kings offered chests of silver. Temple priests declared she had surely earned the favour of Athena herself. Myrto politely refused almost every request. There is only one cloak. She believed it was enough. If one garment had quieted the storms, why would anyone wish to create another? For several glorious weeks, life appeared better everywhere. Children played beside beaches that no longer frightened their parents. Fishing boats returned with record catches. Merchants reached distant ports ahead of schedule. Poets praised the peaceful sea with such enthusiasm that Poseidon himself would probably have found it slightly excessive. Yet quietly, almost too quietly to notice, small changes began appearing. The great sailing ships leaving Egypt drifted helplessly once they reached open water. Without steady winds filling their sails, they stopped moving altogether. Oars could push small fishing boats. They were almost useless against enormous merchant vessels. Far inland, millers noticed another problem. The great wooden sails of their windmills stood motionless. Grain remained unground. Farmers waited. Nothing happened. The clouds also behaved strangely. Heavy rain gathered above the western sea but refused to travel inland. The mountains waited. The rivers slowly shrank. Olive groves that should have welcomed winter rains remained dry. At first, no one connected these events. A stranded ship here, a silent windmill there, an unusually dry valley somewhere else. Each seemed like an isolated inconvenience. High above the world, however, Iolaus stood upon his floating island, watching every current of air spiral across the earth. 4 great winds had always danced in perfect balance. Now one was missing, not weakened, not sleeping. Gone. The keeper of the winds closed his eyes and followed the faintest trace of Boreas's immortal essence. It led not to a mountain, nor to the sea, but to a single crimson cloak hanging quietly inside a weaver's workshop overlooking the cliffs of Thessaly. Aeolus had governed the winds since the earliest days of the world. From his floating island, hidden beyond the wandering clouds, he commanded the 4 great winds as a conductor leads an orchestra. Boreas ruled the cold northern gales. Zephyrus carried the gentle breath of spring. Notus brought the heavy southern rains, while Eurus wandered unpredictably from the east, proving that even immortal winds occasionally enjoyed surprising everyone. Together, they kept the world alive. Sailors often cursed them. Farmers prayed for them. Children flew kites because of them. Poets exaggerated them. But few mortals understood that every breeze, every storm, and every quiet evening depended upon an ancient balance older than Olympus itself. For centuries, that balance had never failed. Until now. Standing upon a cliff of white cloud, Iolaus watched ribbons of air flow across the world. Normally they twisted together in graceful currents that wrapped around mountains, crossed seas, and carried rain wherever the earth thirsted for it. Now, one current simply stopped. It was as though someone had removed a single string from a finely tuned lyre. The melody still existed, but something essential was missing. Boreas had vanished, not died, not fled, captured. Following the faint trace of the north wind's immortal essence, Iolaus descended from the heavens. The journey carried him over forests where leaves no longer rustled, across seas where ships floated helplessly without progress, past windmills whose great wooden sails stood frozen against the sky like abandoned monuments. Every mile confirmed his fear. The silence was spreading. By sunset, he reached the lonely workshop overlooking the cliffs of Thessaly. Myrto stood outside hanging newly woven blankets beneath the winter sun. Curiously, they remained perfectly still. She noticed the traveller approaching along the cliff path. He appeared older than any man she had ever seen, though his eyes carried the brightness of a clear autumn morning. His silver hair drifted gently around his shoulders. Despite the fact that no breeze existed, he wore no crown, no armour, only a weathered blue cloak embroidered with tiny spirals resembling moving air. Myrto welcomed him politely, offering warm bread and watered wine according to the ancient customs of hospitality. The stranger accepted both with quiet gratitude before his gaze settled upon the remarkable cloak resting inside her workshop. Immediately the silver threads trembled. A faint whisper escaped the fabric. The trapped breath of Boreas recognized its master. Aeolus closed his eyes. The truth was exactly as terrible as he had feared. The north wind had not merely touched the cloak. Part of his immortal essence had become woven into its threads. No ordinary knife could cut it free. No fire would burn it. The weaving itself had become part of the world's natural order. Myrto watched the stranger's expression carefully. "You know my work. I know what it contains." For the first time since finishing the cloak, uncertainty crept into her heart. The old traveller stepped toward the loom. His voice remained calm. Not angry, not accusing, simply certain. He explained that winds were not created merely to frighten sailors or scatter rooftops during storms. They carried clouds across mountains. They filled rivers with rain. They cooled summer fields. They guided birds during migration. They carried ships toward distant families waiting patiently at harbours. Without movement, the world itself slowly stopped breathing. Myrto listened respectfully, but as she looked toward the peaceful sea below the cliffs, where no storm threatened a single fisherman, she found herself unconvinced. Surely, a world without violent winds was still a kinder world. Aeolus saw the doubt in her eyes. He realized words alone would not persuade her. And somewhere far beneath the sea, Poseidon had already begun wondering why even his greatest storms no longer answered his call. At first, Myrto believed Aeolus had been mistaken. The sea below her workshop remained calm and inviting. Fishing boats drifted safely across gentle waves. Children played along quiet beaches, without frightened parents calling them back from the water. And not a single storm cloud darkened the northern horizon. Everything appeared peaceful. Everything appeared better, yet appearances have always possessed an unfortunate talent for arriving before consequences. The first troubling news came from the great harbour of Piraeus. Several merchant ships had sailed proudly into open water, carrying wine, olive oil, and finely crafted pottery bound for distant islands. Days later, they remained exactly where they had started. The sails hung limp. The sea stretched smooth in every direction. The captains could see their destination on the horizon. They simply could not reach it. The strongest rowers managed only a little progress before exhaustion forced them to stop. Great trading vessels had never been built to fight an endless windless sea. Cargo spoiled beneath the sun. Fresh water grew scarce. Crews began rationing food, while sitting in full view of the coastline they could no longer approach. The sea had become less an open road than a beautiful prison. Far inland the problems multiplied. The old windmills that ground wheat into flour stood motionless day after day. Their broad wooden sails pointed toward empty skies, waiting for a breeze that never arrived. Millers tried pushing the great wheels by hand. They quickly discovered why humanity had invented windmills in the first place. Bread became scarce in nearby villages. Farmers carrying sacks of grain found themselves standing in silent mills that could no longer perform the work of a single afternoon. Nature itself seemed increasingly uncertain. Clouds gathered above the western sea but refused to continue inland. Heavy rain remained trapped over the water, while valleys farther east baked beneath an unusually dry winter sun. The rivers feeding vineyards and olive groves slowly shrank. Shepherds began leading thirsty flocks farther into the mountains, searching for fresh springs. Even the forest sounded different. Leaves no longer whispered together. Pine trees stood perfectly still, creating an unsettling silence that many villagers found harder to endure than winter storms. Birds also struggled. Migrating flocks circled aimlessly above the coastline, confused by the absence of familiar air currents that had guided countless generations across the sea. Some landed in places they had never visited before. Others simply waited. No creature understood the wind better than those who depended upon it. One afternoon, Myrto climbed the familiar cliffs carrying her remarkable cloak. She expected the usual quiet. Instead, she found something stranger. Absolute silence. No gulls cried overhead. No grasses bent against invisible currents. Even the waves struck the rocks without their familiar spray. For the first time since completing the cloak, she felt uneasy. Not frightened. Responsible. She wrapped the shimmering garment more tightly around her shoulders. Deep within its silver threads came a faint sound. Not a whisper. Not quite a voice. A long, weary sigh. It was Boreas. The north wind had not vanished. He was still alive inside the weaving, pressing endlessly against invisible threads that no longer allowed him to roam the skies. Far above Olympus, Poseidon stood upon a lonely stretch of open sea. He raised his mighty trident and summoned the greatest storm he could command. Dark clouds answered. Lightning flashed. Rain began to fall. But the storm refused to move. It remained fixed above a single patch of ocean, trapped in perfect stillness. Even the gods, it seemed, had begun to discover that power meant very little. If nothing in the world could carry it forward, the gods rarely worried. Mortals worried about harvests. Kings worried about wars. Merchants worried about profits. The Olympians generally assumed that, given enough time, everything would return to its proper place. After all, they had watched civilizations rise and disappear like footprints washed from a beach. But this time, something fundamental had changed. High upon Mount Olympus, Zeus stood beside the edge of the heavens, watching clouds gather over the western sea. He lifted one hand. Thunder rolled across the sky. Lightning split the darkness. Yet the enormous storm remained fixed above the same stretch of water. It refused to travel inland. The clouds simply circled endlessly, trapped as though invisible walls surrounded them. Zeus frowned. Clouds obeyed the winds. Without them, thunder ruled only a single corner of the sky. Nearby, Demeter walked through her sacred orchards. The first signs of drought had already reached the earth. Fields that should have welcomed gentle winter rain remained dry beneath pale sunlight. Young wheat struggled to emerge. Olive trees held their leaves tightly, conserving what little moisture remained. The goddess understood what mortals had not yet realized. Spring itself was beginning to arrive unevenly. Far below the sea, Poseidon struck the ocean floor with his great trident. Mountains of water rose instantly. The sea answered its lord with enormous waves. Yet without Boreas to seize them, the swells rolled only a short distance before collapsing back into perfect stillness. His storms had lost their voice. Even the dolphins swam strangely. Schools of fish drifted into unfamiliar waters. Sea turtles abandoned ancient migration routes followed for countless generations. Nature remembered patterns older than humanity. Those patterns were quietly unravelling. Meanwhile, Aeolus returned to his floating island. For centuries he had kept the four great winds within enormous bronze caverns, releasing each according to the changing seasons. Now one chamber stood empty, or rather, silent. The chains that once guided Boreas still trembled faintly, sensing their absent master. Without the north wind, the remaining three winds struggled to maintain their ancient dance. Zephyrus wandered farther north than ever before. Notus carried rain into lands that should have remained dry. Eurus shifted unpredictably across the eastern sea, creating strange currents that confused both sailors and migrating birds. One missing wind had thrown every other into disorder. The balance had never depended upon strength alone. It depended upon harmony. Back in Thessaly, Myrto finally began witnessing the consequences herself. A merchant caravan arrived carrying desperate news from distant islands. Entire fleets had become stranded between ports. Food shipments failed to arrive. Fishing villages began rationing grain because trade had nearly stopped. A fisherman she had known since childhood confessed that calm seas no longer comforted him. "They don't move," he said quietly. "The sea feels—" He searched for the right word. Asleep. That evening, Myrto unfolded the miraculous cloak inside her workshop. The silver threads shimmered softly beneath candlelight. She placed one hand upon the fabric. Immediately, an icy current raced beneath her fingertips. The cloth stirred, not outwardly, within itself. She suddenly realized the cloak was growing heavier, not in weight, in presence. It no longer felt like woven wool. It felt alive. Deep inside the shimmering threads, Boreas was still struggling. Not with anger, with exhaustion. He had spent weeks pressing endlessly against invisible fibres that refused to release him.